delighted to introduce Andy Worthington and Tom Wilner. Andy and I are actually old friends from 20 years ago. I haven't seen him in 20 years. This is the first time he's been to the States, so lots of new things. Andy, of course, the author of the Guantánamo Files, which is based on 8,000 pages of documents about the Guantánamo detainees, and really is by far the best, I think, account of who these people are and where they came from. Andy's also a historian and a journalist. He's written about a variety of different subjects other than Guantanamo. In his articles have appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, and other newspapers. And then Tom Wilner will speak afterwards. Tom is a managing partner at Sherman & Sterling. He's represented a number of the Guantanamo detainees. He's a graduate of Yale University and the University of Pennsylvania Law School, lead counsel to the government of Venezuela, and has lead counsel in more than 40 international trade proceedings before USTR, and its Department of State and Commerce, and other entities. So Andy will go first, and then Mr. Warner, and then we'll have Q&A. Thanks.
Nice speaking to you.
Whatever you feel comfortable with.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, everybody. There's a few people who can't see me around the podium here, but hello. It's great to be here. As Peter said, this is the first time that I've been in the States. I can't imagine how I've managed to spend so much of my life not coming here, and it's really great to be here. I thought the best thing that I could do really was to run through the way that I came up with the book, how it came about, and what were my discoveries while doing it. Well, like a lot of people, I'd been worried, I think would be the fairest way to say about it, from when Guantanamo opened, that there was something that seemed rather extreme about the images that we first saw of the shackled and hooded and sensory deprived prisoners arriving at Guantanamo. And I kind of followed the stories that came out in those first few years, and of course there was very little that came out in the first few years, but there were certainly a number of prisoners, mainly Afghans and Pakistanis, who were released during that time. And when I really decided to study it in detail, I was actually quite fortunate, because it coincided with the result of a lawsuit that was filed by the Associated Press. The Associated Press had requested, under Freedom of Information legislation, that the Pentagon released information about the prisoners. This was 4 years in, and had been turned down, so they then took them to court, and they won the case. So just as I was beginning to ask myself the big question, who is in Guantanamo Bay, the one that was going to then consume the next year and a half of my life, was the same time that the Pentagon released the documents. So what this consisted of for the first time was the names and the nationalities of everybody who had been held in Guantanamo, and also 8,000 pages of transcripts from the tribunals that had been held there. Now the tribunals were they took place from the summer of 2004 until the spring of 2005, and they were themselves part of the legally dubious processes that were taking place at Guantanamo. And they came about as a result of a Supreme Court decision in June 2004 that after 2.5 years, the Supreme Court ruled that in fact the Guantanamo Bay was effectively under US sovereignty and was not this kind of weird no man's land that the administration had claimed, and that therefore the detainees had habeas rights. They had the rights to challenge the basis of their detention. Now this was clearly intended to enable the detainees to have some meaningful way of finding out why they were being held, but the administration almost immediately resorted to implementing these military tribunals. Now, these allowed the detainees to tell their stories, and it was exactly through this that I was enabled to start investigating who these previously anonymous people were. But the problem with them is that they really failed to meet any standards that would be required, in the U.S. mainland or internationally, and that secret evidence was withheld from the detainees. And also the detainees were not allowed legal representation during the tribunals. They were given a personal representative who was a member of the military, who in some cases helped them and in other cases didn't. So it's a really unfair process. But like I say, the interesting thing about it then, and it remains true to this day actually, is that for a significant number of the prisoners held in Guantanamo, this was their only opportunity to tell their story in any way which eventually came out into the public domain. So I set about studying these stories and transcribing the stories of the men. And what that really enabled me to do was to build up a chronology of who had been captured where and when. Because when these tribunal transcripts were released, and some of you may remember when they came out in March 2006, because the Associated Press ran about 50 little snippets of stories somebody had gone through the documents and had picked out, here's a little bit of a story about this guy, here's another bit of a story about this guy. It was quite hard from that really to gain any overall context of, is this guy telling the truth, is this guy not telling the truth? I mean, this is part of the problem of establishing somewhere beyond the law where, the normal methods that we would use to determine what the truth is about a case is that somebody's charged with something and has a trial and is represented and a jury makes a decision and we pretty much accept that works in most cases, whereas what we seem to have with the Guantanamo documents was one side telling one story and another side telling another story, and a great difficulty working out who was actually telling the truth. But by studying them in detail and getting an overview of it, that enabled me to understand that a certain number of people were captured in Afghanistan. Quite a large group of people were captured crossing from Afghanistan into Pakistan during a very short period of time, actually, in December 2007. During the course of a week to 10 days, I think about a third of the people who ended up in Guantanamo were captured.
In the December of 2001.
Sorry, 2001. Yeah. I also was able to discover that there were about at least 120 prisoners, possibly more than that, who were captured in Pakistan and who had not necessarily ever been in Afghanistan in the first place, and certainly a lot of them had never been in Afghanistan. They were simply captured in Pakistan, far from the supposed battlefield. And then, of course, there are several dozen people in Guantanamo who were captured far from Afghanistan. There are 17 other countries where people were captured and rendered, subjected to extraordinary rendition, and either were sent to prisons in Afghanistan and then on to Guantanamo, or in some cases were sent to other countries where they were held and interrogated under very dubious circumstances and then ended up in Guantanamo. And so by studying these stories, I was able not only to work out who had been captured where and when, but also to begin to understand the circumstances under which for example, with the Pakistanis, that the people who were captured in Pakistan, once I started to look at these stories in detail, it became deeply shocking because so many of these people were, they were people who had left their home countries in the Gulf or in North Africa years before, had been living in Pakistan for years, were working for humanitarian aid charities, they'd been there, for ages, were doing these jobs, and they were, and suddenly I'm confronted by these story after story after story of people who are just rounded up, people who are walking in the street who are rounded up, people who are on buses, taken off the buses, people who are in mosques. And what kind of underlay a lot of this, as we all discovered as the years went on, was that there had been bounty payments which had been offered by the U.S. military for Taliban and Al-Qaeda suspects, and very clearly what had happened in Pakistan and Afghanistan as well was that a very significant number, I think as many as 90% of the people who ended up in U.S. custody had not actually been captured by U.S. forces, but had been captured by their Afghan or Pakistani allies and were handed over or sold because of these bounty payments that were available. And I think a particularly shocking example of the scale of this was demonstrated a few years ago when President Musharraf, in his autobiography, boasted that that Pakistan had received billions of dollars for the handing over of hundreds of terror suspects. So we have this problem that that these people were not captured on the battlefield in most cases, as the administration claimed, and when I then looked further into the story to investigate what was the sequence really from their capture to ending up at Guantanamo to the tribunal process. Now, I've explained a bit about the tribunal process, about how that was skewed. I think that's putting it mildly, but that was skewed in favor of finding that these people were enemy combatants and had been absolutely correctly seized, and there was no question about it. More worrying, I think, was that even before that, in Afghanistan, there were the two main U.S. prisons that were used for processing the prisoners before they were sent to Guantanamo were at Kandahar Air Base and at Kandahar Airport and at Bagram Air Base. Now, I think we're very fortunate, actually, that there's a man whose real name I don't know, but his pseudonym was Chris Mackey, and he was a senior interrogator at Kandahar and Bagram, and he wrote a book about his experiences called the Interrogator's War, I think is what it's called. It has different titles in England and the US. He changed the names of everybody mostly in his book, but he told a story of the sequence of how things had happened. And I think the most disturbing thing that came out of this was that every Arab who ended up in US custody in the prisons in Afghanistan was sent to Guantanamo regardless of whether there were any doubts about their story. When the lists of the prisoners were compiled, they were sent to the senior military figures and senior figures in intelligence who were actually at Camp Doha in Kuwait. They were fed the lists of prisoners, and the rules that they then handed back to the interrogators in Afghanistan were really that blunt and that simple. Every Arab is transferred to Guantanamo regardless. And this was the case with the majority of the Afghans as well, and that's effectively the whole population of Guantanamo. There was a little get-out clause that was developed by the people running the prisons, running Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan in June 2002, when they were getting so fed up of sending so many innocent Afghans to Guantanamo that they came up with their own little category, a special category of people that they could keep off the record books for a fortnight, so that they could clear out some of these farmers who'd been rounded up incorrectly and not send them on to Guantanamo. I think they were so appalled by the scale of how many people who shouldn't have been sent to Guantanamo were being sent there. So those are the kind of overall stories that I came up with in the book. And if you want statistics, I would think that from my way of looking at it, now this is not an exact science, obviously, but it seems to me that about half the people who ended up in Guantanamo were completely innocent people. They themselves break down into two categories of people. About half of those are Afghans. Over a third of the population of Guantanamo throughout its history has been Afghans. Some of these people were Taliban conscripts who were obliged to fight with the Taliban. A really rather shockingly significant number of these people were betrayed by their personal enemies. And the problem there, I think, really is that the U.S. military was in largely unknown territory. So it established relationships with warlords at various places and at various times, and ended up trusting people when that was not necessarily a good idea to do. And so a significant number of Afghans ended up there because the guys the U.S. military were trusting were untrustworthy, and they just used them to remove their personal rivals. I mean, I think the most shocking aspect of the Afghan story is that several dozen people ended up in Guantanamo who were not only blameless, but were actively working with the Karzai government. There were like I say, dozens, I think, of people who had involvement with U.S. forces in a positive manner, but the various aspects of the people responsible were not talking to each other. So that's roughly half. The other half are theoretically, they're slightly more problematic, obviously, because these were people who were fighting with the Taliban in Afghanistan. There are certainly hundreds of people who have been and continue to be held in Guantanamo were fighting with the Taliban. The majority of these people, it seems, were from the Gulf and countries and from North Africa, and had been recruited generally by fatwas issued in their home countries, encouraging them to go and help the Taliban establish a pure Islamic state by winning the battle that was required in Afghanistan, which of course was to defeat the Taliban's enemies in Afghanistan, the Northern Alliance, who were also Muslims. And this, of course, was a struggle that had been going on for years before 9/11. So the most basic model of, what were these guys doing out in Afghanistan when they were seized was that they'd traveled there before 9/11, they'd gone out to help the Taliban in an inter-Muslim civil war that had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda or 9/11. Now, this clearly isn't the whole story. There were, of all the military training camps that people went to in Afghanistan, there were clearly some that had associations with Al-Qaeda and with Osama bin Laden. It's difficult to know. Obviously there's a grey area as to, some of these guys are not going to be telling the truth about, no, we never really knew anything about that. We were just helping with the Taliban. But it's certainly very clear that for a large number of people that was their only involvement, was that they were there fighting the Taliban. They didn't necessarily have this involvement that a handful of people would have had. People who showed a particular promise or a particular interest in the global jihad would have been picked out and chosen for something more special. But your average foot soldier, I think, had very little to offer. But this, of course, I think I should probably lead on to say that the remaining category of prisoner at Guantanamo are the people who are genuinely dangerous. The reason that it was set up in the first place. I wouldn't claim for a minute that there aren't genuinely dangerous people there. But from an analysis of reports that have come out from former and serving officials who've been cited in the press in fairly significant articles over the last several years. Until the summer of 2004. In the summer of 2004, there had been 759 prisoners in Guantanamo at that point. And of those, the senior intelligence officials who'd spoken about it had suggested that the number of people who were connected in any meaningful way to Al-Qaeda was somewhere between a dozen and slightly more than 24. And since then, there have been two more deliveries of prisoners to Guantanamo. There were 10 people who were delivered in September 2004. We don't generally hear that much about them. This is probably not the time to go into their stories. Probably it would be much better to read them in the book. But of these 10 prisoners, I strongly suspect that by no means were all of these people involved in terrorism. I think there are some pretty substantial miscarriages of justice involved in those stories. But, a few of them, quite possibly. And then, of course, the delivery of 14 high-value detainees in September 2006, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Abu Zubaydah and people. You can probably add those figures up as well as I can to realize that leaves us with something between, I think, maybe 40 and 50 people who have any meaningful connection with Al-Qaeda out of the nearly 800, which is a success rate is something around 5%, which is pretty shocking, I think, after this whole story to have ended up with a result like that. And I think if we were to apply that to any other sort of system of detention that we were to look at, to say, well, we had a 1 in 20 success rate. I'm sorry about the other 19. It really would be rather shocking if that was what we were living with in our day-to-day lives. And but that, I think, is what's happened at Guantanamo. I shall leave it at that now and let Tom speak about some of his personal experiences, and then hopefully we can have a questions and answers, and we can address some of the other issues that may not have been discussed, and some issues to do with what may happen in the future at Guantanamo. I'd certainly be happy to talk about that as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, I thought maybe I would stand up here, only because I feel, not because I like standing up, and I thought we're disenfranchising you a bit. Well, thanks, and I apologize. I think I kept everybody waiting. I got caught in a taxi and then had to walk a long way. I want to say, first of all, that Andy's book is great in really going through and finding out who is at Guantanamo. It is a shocking story. I want to not disagree a little bit, but I don't want you to have the impression that all the Arabs who went to Afghanistan went there to fight with the Taliban. It's true in the RAND report, which is no liberal organization, pointed out that Afghanistan at the time of 9/11 was considered the worst humanitarian crisis area in the world. It had had, I don't know how many straight years of civil war and drought for about 7 years as well. There was a big push, and I don't know how many people have been in the Middle East. I had not really much before, and I represented the Kuwaitis. It's a tremendous emphasis in Kuwait of the obligation you have as a rich country to go help people who are suffering. And I have no doubt that a lot of, people say, oh, guys are claiming that they're charity workers, and that's just a, cover for being with something. Well, a lot of these people were charity workers. Of course, the administration said if you're dressed like a civilian, that's a cover for being a terrorist. Well, you guys are dressed like civilians, and I don't think you're probably terrorists either. With respect to who's down there, I agree with Andy. We have never said everyone is innocent, but I am damn sure that a damn lot of them are innocent. Statistically, as Andy said, I think only, 10% or 8% or something like that were picked up by U.S. forces. The others were turned in by Northern Alliance or Pakistani forces at a time when, and you can't trace one-to-one, but a time when we were offering substantial bounties. But very few were picked up in or near a battlefield. I don't know, but what is it, about 10% or something? Over time, as Andy said, only 8% have been accused of having any significant connection with Al-Qaeda. Those are amazing facts that people don't know. Even after these facts came out, even after Andy published statistics, the administration would still say these are all bad guys. And one of the interesting things about Guantanamo as we go on, and I think of what has happened, is what's happened to the truth in our society. A story comes out, but the administration then denies it or says something else, and the public doesn't know who to believe. What's happened is a sort of degeneration of any verification of what the truth can be. We know the truth. We've seen the statistics. It doesn't matter to people. We talked about, tell a little bit about it. One of my clients was a guy, he had never been in Afghanistan, as he said, until he was sold for a bounty in Pakistan and taken to a prison in Afghanistan. It's just extraordinary stuff. We brought case, actually, the Center for Constitutional Rights brought a case in late February 2002, and then my law firm, I brought a case on behalf of the Kuwaitis about a month later. I want to mention one thing before we get there, because it's extraordinary to me as well that Guantanamo and everything that's happened in the war on terrorism has been a violation not only of the rule of law, which we can explain, which is seems to many people a more nebulous concept, but direct violations of existing U.S. policy and regulations. The military has very well-defined regulations for what you do when you pick up somebody and you're not quite sure whether they're an enemy combatant or not. And this is, everybody gets things confused, but we've never disputed if somebody is a fighter against you, you can hold them until the end of the conflict. The question is, are these people really fighters against you, or are they guys you get by mistake? The U.S. military. We first had it in Vietnam. When you picked up people dressed as civilians, you don't know what they are. The U.S. military, in accordance with the Geneva Conventions, has very precise regulations saying you hold a hearing in the field, close to the time and place of capture, and you try to determine whether you got the right guy. And this has come out, I mean, I think we should scream about this, but the military at the time of Guantanamo planned to hold these hearings. They wanted them in the fields. The White House vetoed them. It's just an amazing thing, and this has all been published on the White House. We still don't know why. So that's why Chris Mackey, in his book, said we didn't have our hearings. What happened is any Arab we ran into was in for a long-term stay at Guantanamo. There was no sifting process on the ground. We just violated our regulations. All we asked for in our case, and have ever asked for, all the Guantanamo cases are about, is seeking a fair hearing for the people who are captured. A hearing where they have a chance to know the reasons that they say that they are an enemy fighter, and some chance to rebut that before a neutral decision maker. We filed our case as a Center for Constitutional Rights in February. We filed it about a month later. They were consolidated. The government's position throughout has been, because these people are foreigners and because we hold them outside sovereign U.S. territory, they're not entitled to any, first they said no rights whatsoever, but certainly no constitutional rights, and they can't go to court. The lower courts first held in their favor, and then, as Andy said, in June 2004, in the Rasul case, the Supreme Court held in our favor. Now, you know, I don't know how many people here are lawyers. It's become sort of complicated. The Supreme Court held that the detainees had the right to habeas corpus under the habeas corpus statute. They also said they intimated that they would have had that right at common law before the Constitution. After we won that case, it was our expectation that these guys would get hearings in court. As Andy said, really what happened, the government immediately put in place a sham, what they call combatant status review tribunals for all these people. Under those tribunals, the people were not allowed lawyers, but beyond that, they were not allowed to see or know of the majority of the evidence against them because it was all deemed classified, so they couldn't see it. And you have extraordinary Kafkaesque hearings where people will say, well, you're an enemy combatant. And he said, well, no, I'm not. And he said, well, you were seen in the presence of an Al-Qaeda member. He said, who? Oh, I can't tell you. Well, you know, where is he from? Can't tell you. You know, if we told you, he said, well, and guys will say, how can I rebut this evidence when I don't even know who it is? I mean, you know, I had one guy, one of my fellows, the only evidence presented against him, no, there are two pieces of evidence, excuse me. One was that he wore a Casio watch, which terrorists wear. It's an extraordinary thing, as he said to me, I would never have bought it had I known that. I thought that was great. But his other thing, that 2 years after he was at Guantanamo, an alias of his name appeared on the hard drive of someone suspected of being connected with Al-Qaeda. He said, well, what alias? I don't have any aliases. I've never had any alias. Well, can't tell you. Whose hard drive? Can't tell you. You know, what's the name of the guy? Where? None of this they couldn't tell me. And he just said, you know, this is all secret evidence. What can I possibly do? He was released from Guantanamo 6 months ago without any apology, without any explanation. But after being there, what, 5.5 years. His daughter was born in captivity, and, you know, while he's in captivity. In any event, that's the sort of thing, that's what the government put in place at that time. We went back to court to say this was unfair. Oh, while they did that, they also next came up and said, well, these people may have the right to go to court, but they don't have the right to lawyers because that's, you know, they're foreigners outside the United States. So we had to go back to court, and the court, we won. Actually, they said that particularly in my one case because they said that either I or my Kuwaiti clients were too dangerous. But the court held in our favor and said we had the right to lawyers. that they had the right to lawyers. Then the government, in an extraordinary legalism, moved to dismiss the cases. And by this time, there have been about 20 new cases filed after we won before the Supreme Court. And they said that, and I don't know how many people are lawyers here, but they said, okay, you may have the right to habeas corpus, but that's a statutory right. And you can't get relief under habeas corpus, they argued, unless you can show that the U.S. Constitution has been violated. And since you have no constitutional rights because you're foreigners outside the United States, you dismiss the case. So it was really repeating the same argument. It's also, for the lawyers in the room, it's an extraordinary misconception of what the writ of habeas corpus means. Because the writ of habeas corpus preceded the U.S. Constitution. It was the most fundamental guarantee of individual liberty and the rule of law. It says that the executive, the king, or the executive, can't just throw somebody in prison without giving that person a chance for a fair hearing before a neutral decision maker. That's all it really means. And the government's entire effort to avoid that by putting people off in a little offshore prison where they can avoid the rule of law was violative of the most. It was something that English lords tried many years ago and was rejected. It's what's happening here. In any event, we argued that before the court. I think before the court ruled, but after they seemed to agree with us in oral argument, the administration went to Congress, and then Congress revoked the right of habeas corpus. We are now have a case pending before the Supreme Court where we argue that revocation of habeas corpus violates the U.S. Constitution, which guarantees the right of habeas corpus. The government, of course, argues that we are not entitled, not only we're not entitled to habeas corpus, we're not entitled to that constitutional guarantee because these people are foreigners outside the United States. One comment on the legal, so that we're waiting for that decision now. A comment on this time, as I say, truth has sort of disintegrated in Guantanamo or in this time. But there's another thing. Only lawyers could make or believe these absurd arguments. I mean, there's something that's happened with lawyers today. It's a pettifogging way to look for close little analysis to avoid the purpose of the law. All we are asking for, as I say, is a fair hearing. There can be no justifiable legal excuse or explanation for denying people a fair hearing. And it's only small-time lawyers, I think, with big reputations who could make these arguments with a serious face. I'll just tell a little bit. I had been representing people at Guantanamo for 3 years before I got to Guantanamo to see them. And we have read a lot and seen on television and in magazines pictures of torture and how horrible it was. And when I first heard about it from all of my clients were tortured. Most of it occurred before Guantanamo and at the prisons in Bagram and Kandahar. But things you couldn't believe, and very much like Abu Ghraib. What's struck me more than that, and it struck them, is the greatest torture for people, for an innocent person, is sitting there year after year after year without a chance to show your innocence, without a fair hearing. I mean, I had one guy, and I mentioned this, it was in the New York Times afterwards, but his interrogators came in and he tried to intimidate. He said, your lawyer's a Jew. This was thing. And so to sort of make him unhappy, and I said this to the New York Times, his interrogator came in and yelled at him afterwards. And he said, what are you going to do? He said, are you going to hit me? He said, hit me all you want, just give me a hearing. And that's ultimately what I think has been at stake here. It's what we fought for. A reflection on these people. Of the 12 Kuwaitis I represented, 8 have been released. No explanation, no apology. I mean, I'll tell you honestly, the first one they released is when we first got down there. He's the only guy I think maybe they should have held. Honestly, he's a wonderful guy, but he was actually captured with a rifle, and he said, well, I was just doing defensive things. I said, well, you got a problem. They released him right away, never told us. The other people who are there, I think they're there because they are people who have a sort of, they're angry, but are sort of strong. And they're not violently angry. They are sort of strong. They don't take crap from anyone. They haven't let their person be affected. And I think that's scary to some people. As I was talking with the ambassador from Kuwait, and it was such a difficult position for Kuwait, which has been pushing on these things because they are dependent on the United States. He said, years ago, he said, the United States assures me these are bad guys. And what he said now is, I'm convinced the only reason they hold these people, despite the way we push it, is not anything they did before, but it's their personality at Guantanamo. Now, there are some bad guys there, but there are a lot of innocent people still there.
Great. Well, thank you very much to both of you. A lot to talk about. So we'll do Q&A, and if you ask a question, please identify yourself and what your affiliation might be. I just had to take my prerogative as the moderator to ask some questions. Do you think, in terms of what we might do with Guantanamo when it closes, how does Guantanamo get closed? It's easy to say, but it's hard to do, it seems. And a sort of corollary to that is, does it make sense to set up national security courts that would do the work of the military tribunals, or would that just create a whole other layer of complications?
Okay. Well, there are a number of elements to closing Guantanamo. One of the problems is that there are, I'll try and keep this brief, but one of the problems is that there are a significant number of people there who've been cleared for release. So they've gone through the tribunals that we talked about earlier and the annual military reviews that they have. And it's been determined that they're no longer a threat to the US and its allies, or no longer have ongoing intelligence value. These are people from China, Uzbekistan, Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, and we run into this problem, which could seem ironic, really, considering what's happened to some of these people in US custody, that they can't be returned to their home countries because they face the risk of torture and because there are very significant treaties in place to prevent this happening. It's a real difficulty knowing what's going to happen to these people. There are things in place to prevent them ending up in the United States, with an apology and would you, can we let you settle here and sorry for all that happened. That's technically not allowed. Other countries have to be found. The U.S. administration spent years asking, I think, almost every country on earth, will you help us out? And finally, in 2006, persuaded Albania, one of the poorest countries in Europe, to take 8 cleared detainees from Guantanamo, 5 Chinese Uyghurs. The Uyghurs are Muslims from the northwest of China, and 3 other guys, an Algerian and an Egyptian and a Russian. All settled in one of the poorest countries in Europe with no kind of backup, no other community there, no prospect of work. I mean, this is better than being in Guantanamo, but it's not really an answer to what happens when these people's lives are ruined. And this is particularly the refugees in Guantanamo, the people who can't be returned. So I don't know what's going to happen with that. There are discussions going on amongst various European countries as to, can somebody be pushed forward to do the right thing? In terms of human rights. And it seems to me that this may be a good time to do it because, we're looking at the end of the current administration and, the end of this year. So maybe European countries can do something knowing that a new administration is coming, that it's a good opportunity to get in there. I don't know. I mean, the other issues of the people who are there, I'll definitely try and keep brief on this one. I don't know what's going to happen with the military commissions, the system of trials that have been established at Guantanamo, which have the same problems as the tribunal process that we were talking about earlier. That they don't correspond with either the U.S. court system or the military's own processes. They're yet another largely lawless innovation of the administration post 9/11, and I can't see how they can achieve results that will be regarded as legitimate. So the problem with these, it seems to me that that this system will probably collapse at some point, and that people will have to be moved to the US court system and tried. Although how that then works, that everything that's happened to these guys, the torture that's happened, how that can be somehow sidelined a little so that some kind of realistic conviction can take place if these people are genuinely guilty, I don't know. I mean, it's really an indication of how it should have been dealt with within the law as it existed to end up with successful prosecutions. Tom, do you have some comments?
Well, just some overall comments. There needs to be the will to close it and to find a solution, first of all, and there hasn't been. It's the government put to work rather low-level people trying to find homes for people who were clearly in Guantanamo by mistake. And while they say they talked to many people, they didn't do it with any political authority. And I can assure you they didn't talk to Hugo Chavez, who probably would have taken them all. So I mean, it was a phony effort, I think, on their part. There was no will. It was more a PR effort to start with. One of the problems at Guantanamo always has been a confusion of the issues involved. I'm sure most people in the room right now are confused. There are really two different types of tribunals. There are two issues. Is somebody an enemy combatant? Did he fight against you? And if so, you can hold him till the end of the conflict. That's number one. Then the second thing is, did somebody commit a war crime? Did they do something really bad, or did they engage in terrorist acts or something which they can be convicted of a war crime? Well, that's the second type of tribunal, and that's a thing that's normally tried in courts. I think for the population in Guantanamo, it's all pretty easy. We should have hearings for everyone to see whether they're properly there as enemy combatants. They never had a fair hearing. For people who we think, and those who are not, should be released. If they don't want to go back to their home country, then we have an obligation now to find them a home, and we should get to work on it. For people who we believe engaged in war crimes, we could try them. I think that I've always thought they could be tried in the U.S. courts. It's a very few number of them, and we should get on with it. I think we face an issue in the future, but it's more a theoretical issue. I won't do it here, but I use a curse word for a legal word. But these issues that finally have gone through, everyone is entitled to the protections of the Geneva Conventions. Different people are entitled to different protections of the convention. The debate, do the Geneva Conventions apply? They apply to anyone captured must be treated humanely. I mean, I don't know how the press allowed the administration for years to get away from that. It's extraordinary to me. I think the press, we, politicians, the press, others, need to be more precise about the issues we're addressing. There is an issue in the future if we really fight a global war on terrorism. How do we pick up people, who does it, and who gives those people a review to make sure that they're not improperly held? They've got to have that. That's an issue that really has not had any valid debate, I think. I think people could say, we can't have an American court review everyone we pick up if we're really, I don't know, maybe you can. But how do you do that? That's the real issue for the future, I think, that's got to be addressed. But it gets all sort of subsumed in this, so we've got to break the issues apart. So.
Ed Berger, why have we not created a whole army of very angry people released from Guantanamo at some point in time? And what is that liable to apply for their future activities around the world as a result of this affair?
Well, from what I understand, I mean, I have spoken about this before. I mean, people do raise this question quite often. Surely, if they weren't terrorists before they went in, they must be when they come out. I think it's a credit to these people's faith, and to the fact that that so many of them had no inclination to any kind of military activity, that they have survived this ordeal and have come out not not profoundly embittered, have not been turned, have not become violent people. They weren't violent people in the first place. And I'm enormously impressed by that, how people can go through what some of these people have been through, and their religious faith gets them through it, and they don't bear malice. The bigger picture of what it's done globally is that, I'm sure that it's created a much bigger problem. It's infuriated people globally. I'm more upset actually by what Tom was talking about, that the moral standing of the United States has been damaged so much, and that it's not possible to stand up and say to regimes run by tyrants who treat people abominably, we say you shouldn't be doing that, because they turn around and say, we're just doing what you guys do these days. And that's shocking and disappointing.
Well, I agree. I think I've been to Guantanamo 13 or 14 times to meet with people, and I am shocked that of the 4 Kuwaitis who are still there, one is so angry he won't talk to anyone. I mean, he won't talk to his friends, he won't talk to Americans or anyone. So the anger has taken hold of him, and he's probably a danger because of what's happened to him there. The other 3 are shocking. It's shocking to me how calm they are. One of them, the Fayez al-Kandari, and Andy and I have talked about him before, but when I first got down to Guantanamo in January 2006, poor Fayez, he had been waiting, and he was such a nice guy. They said one question, and other people were talking, explaining the legal case. He said, I'll wait. His one question was, he said, is it true that the American people re-elected George Bush? Don't they know what's happening down here? He said, I've lived in America. This is not America. And this other guy, Fauzi al-Oda, has taken that. They've lived in America. So their view is America really doesn't know what's happening because this is so un-American. So they haven't transferred this hate to America. It's amazing to me, and he's much calmer. Wisdom will prevail again, is the way he thinks about it. This is when I'm about to give my Obama pitch, but there's no doubt worldwide that every place I go, Guantanamo is thrown up as an excuse for how the United States has lost its way, and it's been a recruiting tool for terrorism around the world.
But just to follow up on that, I mean, there is no doubt that Abdullah Massoud became an important leader of the Taliban once he was released from Guantanamo. And the DoD says there's something like 24 people that have actually either returned to the battlefield or started on the battlefield since they've been released. So are those numbers credible?
Well, and I'll let Andy address the numbers more, although we have always asked, said we want to see this. But that's the result of a lack of a process. Those people were released not after, a process. They were released by the U.S. government in their process, which was purely a political process. People were asked, so there was no review. When you don't have a valid review, you get mistakes both in who's held and who's released, it seems to me. And so.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I studied some of these stories, and what I found, really particularly appalling about this is that the administration has made these claims and has come up with large figures which they then refuse to back up when asked. Can we have some details? No, they throw out a few. The ones that people who've studied it look at come up with a completely different answer as to why these people returned to the battlefield. These people returned to the battlefield because these are a handful of people who were on the battlefield in the first place. They were people who were fighting with the Taliban. They had command roles in the Taliban. What happened? They went to Guantanamo. They said, "You've got the wrong guy. I'm just a rug merchant." In fact, there was one guy who said he was a rug merchant. He insisted. The administration let him go. Now, there were plenty of people in Afghanistan waiting, had been saying, "Can we come to Guantanamo to see who you've got? Because we know who the senior Taliban people are. We've been fighting against them for years." There were people in Afghanistan saying, "When they come back to Afghanistan, will you let us see them, just so we can check that you're not letting out a guy who said he was a rug merchant, but we know who he is?" And they never did. So it's actually their fault that they let go these guys who went back to the battlefield, because the people who knew who they were not consulted.
Richard Wetzel from the German Historical Institute. Thank you for the wonderful presentations, although I suspect you're mostly preaching to the converted here. One thing I wanted to say, for those of you who haven't seen the documentary, Taxi to the Dark Side, is that the title which the New America Foundation had a screening of a couple of weeks ago. Go see it, which is a wonderful way of addressing all these issues. My question for both of you is, you know, in a way, how is this possible? I mean, it's one thing to look at the origins and say, okay, in the fog of war, in the confusion of things, maybe there were a lot of people that really did believe, as Donald Rumsfeld told us, that these were the worst of the worst. But as they took a closer look, surely you're not the first ones that realized, well, we got a lot of the wrong people here. What explains why the local people in Guantanamo, in the military, all the way up to the White House, and that then also the Congress hasn't really sort of acknowledged this and taken any action? And best of all, when it comes time to legislate, as you mentioned, the Congress decided, oh, well, we'll just strip them of habeas corpus. That will solve the problem. I mean, that's been most shocking to me, not just what's happening there, but unfortunately we're in a situation where almost everything there is to know has come out, and we as a country and our politicians, and as you mentioned, the press, hasn't really stepped up. And I'm still puzzled how that's possible. Any thoughts on that? I know it's a tall order.
Well, I'd obviously like to hear what Tom says, and as a visitor, I certainly don't want to start criticizing people that don't deserve it. But I mean, I'm looking from outside, unable to understand how your politicians have enabled so much of this to pass. I mean, I know how hard lawyers have worked to address this issue at the beginning, and I know about the decisions that, although it can seem from the outside, and probably is, that these are glacial processes that seem to take forever. There are important decisions that have been made by the Supreme Court, which have then been undermined by an administration that just does not want anybody to say no to it. We'll just ignore verdicts. We'll issue signing statements about laws of like, yeah, that's a great law, but only if I don't disagree with you. And I don't know. I mean, the difficult thing obviously is that it as a response to 9/11, there was so much will to get the right people in the beginning that it took some time for questions to be raised. And I think we probably all know that it took really until 2004, 2005 for some of the big questions about what's really been going on here to first surface. I think the Abu Ghraib photos, because they were photos rather than stories, were such a big thing. But it took a long time. But as to now, I don't know. I don't know what extra thing is required to really crystallize how appalling this has been, and particularly, how can we stop this happening again? How can we bring this to a halt and say, we must not be doing it?
All right. Can I just ask you, when the Congress passed sort of struck down the right for habeas, what else was bundled in those set of laws? Was it, because there might have been something else in there that was attractive to your average congressman who may not have really understood what was being passed because it was bundled with a lot of other stuff.
But that was, no, it was pretty, in December 2005, Lindsey Graham, or actually it was in November, just before Veterans Day weekend, Lindsey Graham slipped an amendment on the floor into the Defense Appropriation Bill to revoke habeas corpus. And it came to a vote. It passed, not by a lot. And then, and this is a certain, and the political push for it was on this. The Republican Party and others made it, you're for terrorists or you're for the president. And, and that was the play. And the Democratic Party was not in the majority at that time. The Republicans were. But going from that quick, I think your question is the most profound one of our times. And Andy put it, how could this have happened, particularly when it's that stark, where you're for terrorists or you're not, that in this time, and how can we stop it from happening again? I mean, I'll tell you, I grew up profoundly proud of being an American. My family came from Russia in the 1880s, and we were able to succeed here, and we were able to succeed here because of what this country stood for, because of the opportunity it gave everyone guaranteed by the rule of law. And I never thought things like this could happen. Now, this is happening to people who are Arabs or Muslims in an isolated place. But the fact that it could happen is so un-American, and on all the levels, I think there have been failures. It's, you know, when we talked about this issue of what is true and what is not true, the fact, and that might be it, you know, that the administration can say, despite the facts, just deny it. Some people said that's a failure of the press, and the press has changed. You know, we don't have CBS, ABC, and NBC dominating with 90% of the people watching, so Walter Cronkite or David Brinkley can take things on. It's become diffused with it. But the lack of politicians here, in every other time, you know, somebody would have stood up and said, this is wrong. You know, this isn't just a little pork barrel issue about who gets more money. These are fundamental issues. And, you know, the only people who had the real guts to stand up originally for all, you know, nobody listened to him, but Al Gore, I don't know whether you remember, he made a speech, he said that we cannot do this. But the former president didn't do it. You know, Jimmy Carter finally came out. Bill Clinton has never said a word. That thing, I mean, you know, honestly, Barack Obama stood with it in, but he was just a junior senator. So there wasn't the political opposition. I'll tell you a story, and I was appalled. When I first started, all the lawyers, now it's a chic thing in law firms to be this way, but originally, I mean, people said, oh, you can't do this, you're against the president. I mean, these are liberal lawyers, I mean, you're against the president, we've got to get behind the president in this. I said, you know, it was amazing. Before we won the first Supreme Court case, I was at a dinner, and I was sitting next to about a 40-ish man and woman law professors. And I looked at them and said, why aren't the law schools up in arms? I said, you know, Guantanamo wouldn't have lasted for 6 months when I was in the 1960s. We would have been protesting, and, you know, this is wrong. You're teaching law. Why aren't the law schools out there? And by and large, they're still not out there. I mean, I get invited to talk to students, but the law schools aren't doing this much. And I remember he looked at me and he said, you're right. This is wrong, but we've got 2 young kids and we're afraid. I thought, oh my God. Now, if you read the things about the rise of Nazism, you read the same sort of things. We're afraid. We knew things were going wrong, but we didn't want to know about it. It's just, so the failures of our society, I thought never can happen in the United States. It scares me. It's the most profound question. That's how do we make it so these things do not ever happen again?
But it turns out the military lawyers were the people who actually did the most to turn things around, or certain military lawyers. Is that your assessment?
They were, well, I don't know, turn things around. They were heroes in that they fought against this. You know, the military will get blamed with this. As I said, the military had rules. A lot of people were furious. I had deep throats. I was telling you, and earlier, these were military guys who said, you got to get down there. You know, most of these people are innocent, that we haven't had the hearings. This is a, oh, yeah. Don't know the answer.
I want to ask a little more of a sort of technical question. And Tom, you had said earlier that let's try these people in the American Court of Justice. And when you talk to DOD and ask them about that, they say, well, we have this whole issue. We can't introduce any of the evidence that we've collected against them because it won't stand the Justice Department's test. So how do you suggest we go about changing laws in the U.S. to be able to do that in the future?
How change the law so they could do it in the future?
Because currently, under the current system we have, it's just not possible.
Oh, well, yeah, but it's possible. I mean, they screwed up a lot of what they did originally to make evidence not admissible. I mean, you know, when you hang a guy by his thumbs and you know, electrically shock him and he says, I've done something, well, that's normally not admissible under the Anglo-American jurisprudence system. If you had sat there, and that's why the big fight came out with the FBI, because the FBI said you're not only not getting evidence we can't use, but you're getting unreliable evidence that people are just saying. But, you know, there are, for the people who are down in Guantanamo, the really bad guys, you know, people say you're giving habeas corpus to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Who gives a damn? All habeas corpus has is there a reason to hold him. We know there's reason to hold Khalid. There's plenty of evidence. You know, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed has admitted to everything. He's admitted openly, not under torture. He said, yeah, I'm your enemy. I've done all these things. The problem is more theoretical than real, I think. In the future, we've got to follow systems so we can do it correctly as we did before.
But just to clarify, how would you, I mean, there would be nothing special that you'd need to do to say, okay, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, we're just going to put you on trial in the Southern District of New York.
No, nothing really. No.
Okay.
I mean, I'd just say as well that, you know, the people tend to forget that there were successful prosecutions that followed the rules before 9/11. There was no reason to change that. These were prosecutions of people involved in Al-Qaeda. And, you know, Tom raised a very fundamental point, really, about the difference. Two schools of interrogation, really. You know, one of which the intent was to abide by the laws, to abide by the Army's own rules, to abide by the laws as they existed, with the intention of you know, getting evidence for a trial, which was the FBI's route. And it wasn't just the FBI, it was the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, some of the other people who were down at Guantanamo. And the other side was, no, this is just about getting information. However, we have to get information to prosecute the war on terror. And from the start, it was being legally admissible. That was something for whims. But, you know, all that was proven wrong. You know, and there is no reason to change anything. I mean, you know, the issue that affects me strongly, and that I think is very important to know, is that there are been lots of attempts to justify torture. Now, not only is it morally repugnant, but it's unreliable. And it also, it's a false tough guy approach. It underestimates the fact that there are talented people out there who are interrogators. This is their job, who can get information out of people without having to do all this. You know, this is what the cases before 9/11 proved. And I'd like to see a focus on these people, and to go back to saying, look how things can work when you stay within the law.
But you know, Bill, but let me just say something about that, and because the only justification for violating the rules, which would make things admissible, evidence admissible, is if there's a need to go beyond them to get information, if there's a need to get reliable information to fight the war on terrorism. And it's interesting to me that in this country, and I don't know whether it's happened in other countries, I know it has in Israel, but there hasn't been a sort of just objective examination. Do you need that? Does it ever work? Is it ever helpful? What is the balance? There's sort of a yelling back and forth. And I used to say, you know, people would come up with these things. Oh, well, you know, what the ticking time bomb. You need to do something. And say, well, how often does that happen? Certainly none of the people in Guantanamo were a ticking time bomb situation. So you know, it doesn't work. So that's why I say, you know, people need to look at that. But I'd like to see an examination. I mean, I've questioned this myself, and I've talked to Israeli counterintelligence people who say, you don't use it, it doesn't work, and you don't get anything. But I'd say, well, look, I know George Bush thinks this works because he's got empirical evidence. He watches the show 24, and it works every week on that show. But that's the way decisions are made. It's sort of a belief-based thing rather than sitting down and really examining it. And so
I agree with that, because it's equally wrong to say that torture doesn't work. We just have no idea.
Yeah.
And in fact, the National Science Foundation, I think, is beginning to look at this question. Of course, it's rather difficult, but how do you have a controlled experiment where you torture one person and then don't torture the other? It's not very ethical. Go ahead.
Peter Eisner. Two questions. Has torture taken place in Guantanamo since 2003? Physical torture. Has it changed since the invasion of Iraq? And two, in your statistics of the population, how many people under 18 have been there, and are there still people under 18 in Guantanamo?
Okay, well, my understanding of the first question you asked about torture, I mean, we could, briefly, I would say that there was a regime that was in place from in 2003 and 2004 in particular. So yes, it was happening after the Iraq War began, which was the system, was the implementation of enhanced interrogation techniques against a significant number of people in Guantanamo. Now, somebody who'd been on the inside who spoke about it, suggested it was about 1/6 of the detainees at that time, which was probably about 600 detainees, so 100 people. And the people who've spoken about this is most of the British, most of the Europeans who were there at the time. Bewilderingly, it's a number of random Afghans. 100 people is quite a lot that these techniques were applied to, and this is prolonged solitary confinement. This is enforced nudity. This is use of extreme heat and cold. This is prolonged use of painful stress positions, sexual, religious humiliation. There's more, but you bundle that package together, and to me, I'm going to call that torture. I'm not going to call that a bit of discomfort. I'm not even going to get into the semantics of like, oh, well, it's bad, but it's not quite torture. I'm calling that torture.
So then, since Abu Ghraib and since the revelations, have they still been doing it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know the details of. I don't think that there doesn't seem to be, from what I've heard, that kind of policy in place. I think there are some extremely disturbing things that still happen in Guantanamo. I think the random and regular use of the immediate reaction force, the pumped-up guards who beat the hell out of anybody for any minor infringement of the rules and do this on a regular basis, from what I understand, is still very regular. And the treatment of hunger strikers I find particularly disturbing. That there are dozens of people who at various times, there are still now, I think, who are force-fed, and the force feeding is particularly brutal and is designed to break their will. And so those kind of things are ongoing. It doesn't seem to me that that it's as much of a, it seemed to me that there was a period where it really did become, a torture camp in a way. Sorry, what was the second issue?
Minors. People under 18.
The people under 18, yes. There are definitely still people who were under 18. There are people who are under 16 when they were caught. The exact numbers I'm not sure of. I know some people studied it. I didn't particularly break those figures down when I was looking into it. There were dozens and dozens of people who were under 18 when they were captured. There definitely still are some. I mean, we've all heard of Omar Khadr, the Canadian who was 15 when he was captured. Funnily enough, and this really bewilders me as to why the administration thinks that in the glare of the world's media, it's a good idea to put people who were children when they were captured on trial. But they put forward an Afghan for trial by military commission before Christmas. He was under 18 when he was captured. It's alleged that he threw a grenade at a coach containing American soldiers. Nobody was killed, but they allege that he did that. There are still other people there. I mean, there's a young man called Mohammed El Garani. He was born in Saudi Arabia, but his parents were from Chad. So the Saudis don't want him back. The Saudis are not interested in any of their residents. They're only interested in their nationals. This poor guy had seen no opportunity really to find anything meaningful that he could do in Saudi Arabia as this kind of third-class citizen, and had travelled out to Pakistan to study. Was just rounded up in a random raid on a mosque, and was taken to Guantanamo, and is still there. And he was 15 when he was caught. The U.S. forces seem to think that he was considerably older than that. But yeah, like I say, he's not the only one. I mean, and I think that's been a scandal. I think that the administration, when it says, really in war there are no such thing as children, come on, there has to be a point at which you've got to draw a point at some point when somebody's so young enough and impressionable enough to have been influenced and not to be directly taking responsibility for their actions.
mentioned there were 17 countries that they're all there from. Can you characterize the attitudes of these 17 countries in any broad sense? Do they condone or complain about the treatment of people from their countries?
Oh, when I mentioned the 17 countries, those were countries where people were captured that were not either Afghanistan or Pakistan, and who were then either via some foreign prison or were then processed through Afghanistan and sent to Guantanamo. But they were these are 17 other countries that people were captured in. So they include 2 British guys who were captured in the Gambia in West Africa, another British guy who was captured in Zambia in Africa. They include people who were captured in Thailand, in Indonesia, in Azerbaijan, in trying to think.
Bosnia and all that.
Yeah, the Bosnians, 6 Bosnians who were seized. I can't remember off the top of my head all the other countries, but I mean the issue with these is that in all of these cases this involved some cooperation with the administration, and you know what really happened after 9/11 was that one way or another an enormous amount of pressure in general was put on other countries to help out. I mean, I would say as a Briton that probably less pressure was required to get the British intelligence services to cooperate in some abductions of people that were based on extremely dubious intelligence. And you know, I mean, I don't want to let my own government off the hook at all in this. And I'm not just saying that because I'm thousands of miles away. I say this when I'm in Britain as well.
Thank you. Jim Rickett, I'm also I'm from the DOD, and I'm a retired Marine. Your comment just about the rounding people around the world. This war has no borders. So you came from England. You could have been a terrorist in England. Now we're over here. If we catch you, are you still a terrorist or not? But in the question about the miners, I was just last week at the Pentagon where Secretary of Defense was given recognition to a 107-year-old World War I veteran. He joined when he was 16.
Okay.
And he was in France when he was young. So people have long lives and they can carry on actually a long time. But I've spoken to American military who've been down in Guantanamo, and they said some of the prisoners, and you might have heard this also, are schooled on how to resist interrogation, what to say when you're being interrogated, how to urinate on your Quran and say that it's been desecrated, and that makes world news. And for the lawyer gentleman, are you working pro bono, or if you find someone who admits you in confidence, I am a terrorist, get me off, it'll be worth it. I know you won't answer that, but
You know, I'll answer it.
Oh,
The
well-
lawyer gentleman will answer your question.
okay. And like I know Frederick today, when he was inspecting one of his prisons, someone said, Your Majesty, I'm guilty. He let him go because there was never any guilty persons in prison. So I'm sure people will try to do anything to get out of prison, even if it comes to lying. So do we have any real guilty people who should be there? And I agree, if they're not guilty, they should be out.
And how do you find out whether they are or they're not?
Well, that's the question.
Whether you believe in the military regulations which require a hearing?
Yes. I
Well,
also
then,
believe in polygraphs.
Okay,
I've
that's
taken
fine, that's
polygraphs.
fine. Those things have not been used. I mean, see, your question, you're afraid, am I working pro bono? What would I do if somebody said I'm a terrorist, get me out? I'm working pro bono. If somebody said I'm a terrorist, get you out, I'd say screw you. You're there. So, but the fact that there may be some terrorists, the fact there may be some bad guys, the fact that people can be air terrorists and grow old, are all problems we need to deal with. But we can't deal with it by assuming that everyone is a terrorist. We can't deal with it by responding to this problem by throwing away our principles. The military had rules on how to do this, and the White House vetoed them. Now, I'll tell you another thing that in August 2002, I mean, you say how these things happen. It's all the wrong pressures, and it's why you have laws and rules. There was a tremendous push to find all the terrorists. September 11 had occurred, and we wanted to find the terrorists. We wanted to get the Taliban. People were sent down there. We were giving money out to do it. I mean, people didn't realize the repercussions of it, but we were buying terrorists. you know, and they came in, and then people were reporting back to Washington, we got these guys, this is great. They said, that's terrific. Let's take them to a place where we could, first try them, we put them in Guantanamo. Then they weren't getting information out of it. And people in Washington said, turn up the screws, take off the kid gloves. And they started doing it, and they weren't getting any information. I mean, that is an amazing story when you think of it, because it just, all these people said, the CIA sent down one of their Arab specialists, this was in June or July 2002, and he interviewed dozens of Guantanamo detainees. He wrote a report back and said, you're not getting information, you got the wrong guys. These guys shouldn't be here, they're not terrorists or nothing. That report went into General Gordon, who took it into the White House, into Gonzalez and Addington, who's and they said, bury it. Bury it. Kill the hearings, don't have hearings. So, are there some bad guys? Is there a problem? Yeah, the question is, how do we deal with it? And we deal with it in accordance with American principles. We don't deal with it the way the Nazis did. I mean, you know, sure they're justified. And when, you know, when guys stay down at Guantanamo, they're trained and all this, the guys at Guantanamo, for the most part, are doing their job. You know, I asked Fauzi Al-Oda last time I was down there, how are you being treated? Are you being treated okay? Is it okay now? You know, when you talk about, he said, Tom, you don't understand. He said, are they beating me up all the time? No, although these IRF teams come in. He said, but these guys, these are nice guys, these young guards out here, they think we're terrorists. They're told we're terrorists. So they treat us like crap. If I were a terrorist, I'd treat them like crap. He said, you know, if anything happens bad in the United States, they yell at us, they do, because they're nice young guys, but they think we're terrorists, and we've never had a chance to show, no, I'm not a terrorist. So, I mean, you know, we agree in principles about what people should be done. We've just got to do it better and in accordance with our ideals.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would say to that is that the problem when you analyze this issue of, you know, which arose from something that's called the Manchester Manual, because it was found in a raid on in Manchester in England in 2000, that Al-Qaeda members are trained to resist interrogation, to allege torture. Okay, this may very well be true, but if you're questioning somebody and this is what they come up with, how do you tell the difference between somebody who's completely innocent, who is telling you exactly the same thing because they're completely innocent, and the Al-Qaeda guy who's disguising it? You can't take that as the basis. Otherwise it becomes exactly like the witch hunts, where there is no innocence. So, you know, Tom's very good at explaining what are the other routes that you have to take, that you can't rely on the fact that, you know, that you regard everybody with suspicion and everything that they say. If they say they're innocent, it means they're guilty. Whoa.
Well, on that note, thank you very, very much.